Welcome to the 45th Annual George B. Hartzog Jr. Awards and Lecture Program, which is sponsored by Clemson University's Institute for Parks and the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. My name is Bob Powell, and I'm the director of the Institute for Parks here at Clemson. This year's event is particularly important, not only because we are here to celebrate the legacy of George B. Hartzog Jr., 7th Director of the National Park Service, native of South Carolina and longtime Clemson supporter, but also to acknowledge the accomplishments of current leaders working to protect our natural and cultural treasures. This long-running program highlights Clemson's commitment to supporting the management and protection of local, regional, and national parks that provide valuable spaces that are not only important for our quality of life, but also our health and overall well-being. As part of the Hartzog Awards program, which took place earlier today, we recognize 5 leaders in the parks and conservation field who I would like to acknowledge now. As I read your names, please stand to be recognized. The William C. Everhart Award was presented to Dr. Catherine Stevenson, Associate Professor in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at NC State. And she was recognized for her sustained commitment to developing the capacity of our nation's environmental educators and in advancing the practice of environmental education. Congratulations, Catherine. Dr. Ian Munanura, Associate Professor in the Departments of Forest, Ecosystems, and Society at Oregon State University, was presented the Dwight A. Holder Award for outstanding work by a graduate of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management, or Forestry and Environmental Conservation, that fosters conservation of natural and cultural resources. In particular, Dr. Munanura is recognized for his leadership and sustained efforts to improve sustainable tourism practices and in protecting and preserving critical habitat across Africa. Lisa Sumption, Director of Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, was presented the Fran P. Manella Award for her sustained leadership as one of the longest-serving state directors and for her national leadership as president of the National Association of State Park Directors and member of the U.S. National Park Service System Advisory Board. Dr. Amanda Stronza, Professor of Ecology and Conservation Biology at Texas A&M University, was presented the Benton H. Box Award for her lifetime of research, advocacy, and leadership protecting some of the world's most iconic endangered wildlife species, and in particular, her innovative approach coupling research, arts, and advocacy to assist in those efforts. Finally, Charles Chuck Sams III, 19th Director of the National Park Service, was presented the Walter T. Cox Award for his sustained public service and leadership. Let's have a round of applause for our award winners. Now, if y'all have been following the news for the last week, the budget negotiations and the threat of a government shutdown was a bit of a roller coaster ride, and it was not clear until Sunday whether Director Sams would be able to attend this year's event. So it is with great relief and my great pleasure to introduce this year's George B. Hartzog Jr. lecturer, Chuck Sams, 19th Director of the National Park Service. Director Sams was ceremonially sworn in as the 19th Director of the National Park Service on December 16th, 2021 by Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland. Sams is Cayuse and Walla Walla and is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Northeast Oregon, where he grew up. He also has bloodlines to the Cocopah tribe and the Yankton Sioux tribe of Fort Peck. Sams most recently served as Oregon Governor's Kate Brown's appointee to the Pacific Northwest Power and Conservation Council, where he held a position as a council member from March to December 2021. Prior to joining the Northwest Council, he served as executive director for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. For 30 years, Sams has worked in tribal and state government and in the nonprofit natural resource and conservation management field, with an emphasis on the responsibility of strong stewardship for land preservation for this and future generations. Sams is a veteran of the U.S. Navy, where he served as an intelligence specialist. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Concordia University and a Master of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law from the University of Oklahoma Law School. He lives with his wife, Laura Lynn Sams, and their youngest daughter in Alexandria, Virginia. Please welcome this year's 45th lecturer, George B. Hartzog Lecturer, Charles Chuck Sams, the 19th Director of the National Park Service.
Nichalo and Naimuma, in Ashwa Nasha Shishkalashquit Iwa Kanish Naknuit Luma Tachamna Nichyawe Pum. Good day, my friends and relatives. My Indian name is Mockingbird with Big Heart, and I come from the place of the Big Springs, which is located in Northeast Oregon on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. The language I spoke to you is Umatilla, and those, I have a few Oregonians out there like Lisa, those might be able to pick up, it comes with a Nez Perce accent. That being said, language is extremely important to understanding who I am as a Native person and my responsibility of stewardship. And so, rather than a slide projector up here and a PowerPoint, I'm going to go old school and just lecture and want you to use your mind's eye and imagination as we begin to tell some story. I would like everyone to take a moment and just close your eyes. Close your eyes and think back into your childhood. Think back to the time that you can recognize when you were learning something from someone else. The moment that spark comes into your life, that you are growing and being taught new things, and the excitement that you felt as you began your journey of learning in a conscious effort. Now open your eyes. For many of us, that may have been a grandparent. For some, it may have been a mother and father. It may have been an aunt and uncle. It may have been an older cousin. But more than likely, your first teachers were one of your elders and a family member. As I said, I come from the place of the Big Springs on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And for myself and my recognition of that moment for me came on a tributary to the Umatilla River. The Umatilla River that flows through the Umatilla Indian Reservation on a place called Esculpa Creek. And I'm about 5 years old or so, walking with my grandfather. And as we're walking along the river, we are building weirs, little dams, in the springtime to help salmon return, to be able to spawn and be able to reproduce on the headwaters of the Columbia River and its tributaries, such as the Umatilla and creeks like Esculpa Creek. He reaches in and he picks up one pebble in particular and he hands it to me. And he says, "Grandson, from time to time, I'm going to ask you questions about this pebble, and I want you to answer to me honestly and openly." That moment, I look back in my own history as an understanding of where my learning adventure begins as a human being. And sure enough, over time, my grandfather would ask me all kinds of questions about that pebble. Who do you think swam over this pebble? Who do you think walked over this pebble? Where did the water come from to run over the top of this pebble? Do you think the pebble where I picked it up was always there, or how did it get there? What made the pebble? It took me a long time to figure out that he was taking me from the specific to the general, that my education began with this pebble and understanding my world in relationship to it, but more importantly, learning history, math, science, human interaction, and responsibility of stewardship. Shortly after that, he told me the story that sticks in my mind. And because I'm so fortunate to be the 19th director of the National Park Service, there's snow flying somewhere in a park right now, and I've seen pictures. Because in my culture, you can't tell story until snow flies. And so I'm going to take advantage that there's snow flying somewhere in a national park right now by telling you a story. Here in North America, there was a time before human beings, when human beings weren't here, just the animal people. And they were living their own lives. The flora and fauna on this land, the earth, the water, the wind, the coyote, the eagle, the cougar, the buffalo, the elk, were all living their lives happily. On what is now known as the Columbia River, we called it, and it was called the Nichiwana. In the Sahaptin language, it means the big river. Deep in the bowels of the river, above a place called Celilo Falls, and below where the Deschutes River now flows into it, there's a deep hole where a monster once lived, Nishla. And the monster came out of its hole and began to eat up the entire known world. It drank up all the water of the river. It ate up all the fish. It ate up all the lamprey. It started to chomp along the rocks and the basalt up and down the Columbia River. It ate up the beaches. It started eating up the air. And the animals started to run away and try to climb higher into the mountains. In particular, they were trying to get was Mount Adams. As they were running up the mountain, there was Coyote. And they're yelling at Coyote, this monster, Nishla, is eating up the entire known world. You have to do something about it. You must stop it. Coyote looked up to the sky, looking for an answer from his creator, and hearing none. He decides to go and talk to the huckleberry people. He runs into the huckleberries in the forest, and he tells them, Nishla is eating up the known world. What can we do? What should we do? The Huckleberry Sisters talked amongst themselves and said, it is up to you to stop the monster. Up to me? Coyote was incredulous to the idea that he would have to stop the monster. They whispered into his ear that you must get 5 sticks and sharpen them. You must go out and collect fuel to start a fire. You must go get flint in order to start that fire. But most importantly is you must jump into the monster's mouth. And then they whispered into him what he must do once he got into the monster's mouth. As he walks down Mount Adams, or Pato as we call it, he can see the monster gobbling up all the known world, working his way all the way around of what had once been the Nichiwana, the great river. And he yells at the top of the mountain, Nishla, eat me! Nishla, come and eat me! And sure enough, in one big gulp, he swallows Coyote. Coyote's stuck now in the mouth and in moving his way down the body of Nishla. And as he's being swallowed and working his way down to the stomach, he can see eyes darting back at him. And he yells out, who's here with me? Eagle screamed out, I'm here. Elk screamed out, I'm here. Cougar growled, I'm here. The plant people wept and said, we are here. And he says, I am here to help. And as soon as he hit the stomach, he started making his way by cutting a hole with the first stick out of the stomach in the monster to look for its heart. He was able to cut through the sinew with the second stick until he finally got to the monster's heart. There, he built a huge fire underneath it and then began to cut with the last 3 sticks all the sinew around the heart of the monster until it plopped into the fire and burned. And in a great belch and death throes, monster threw back up all of the water, all of the land, all of the air, all of the animals back out onto the landscape and placed them everywhere. And eventually he coughed so hard that he pitched the heart all the way in what is now Idaho, near Winchester, where the heart of the monster actually exists. It's this huge stone that as a child that I was taken to understand this story and its relevance, that we, the animal people, had been providing and protecting and had forgotten how to preserve and protect their resources. The becoming of human And how I understand how I became human is through what we call in the Columbia River Basin, Tumunwit. And for many folks, when it was first interpreted by the settlers who came out west, they thought the word meant the law. It does in some ways. But the actual translation for Tumunwit means to be stood up, how we became human. For when it was decided by our Creator to create this thing called human, he called down to Coyote and told him to come to Pato once again. So he climbed to the very top of Mount Adams. And our Creator said to Coyote, I'm giving you this medicine bag. You will wear it around your neck, and you will ask all the other people on the earth to provide a gift so I can create this thing called human. Okay. So Coyote puts it around his neck. He's already saved the world, but now they're going to create another being on the landscape, this thing called human. So as he's glissading down the mountain, he looks up and he sees Eagle. And he yells up to Eagle, Eagle, this thing called human is coming. Creator wants to know if you can give it a gift. Eagle thinks about it for a while, circles around, dives down, and says, here, you may have part of my eyesight, so this thing called human will be able to see on the landscape. This is a good gift. He places it in his medicine pouch, and he continues down the mountain. When he gets to the edge of the big forest, he looks up into the trees, and in the trees is an owl, and he yells out to Owl, Owl, this thing called human is coming. Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. And the owl says, I will give part of my hearing so he can hear the splendors and the music of the land. He can hear the wahli, he can hear the wind. This too is a good gift. As he walks through the trees, he looks out and he comes into a meadow. And in the meadow are all the plant people, the couch, the roots, and the berries. And he yells out to the plant people, this thing called human is coming, and Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. The plant people say, we will give part of our root system. That way it will be able to nourish itself and be able to have and take all the nourishment in throughout its body. This too is a good gift. He's making his way down and he's asking all the animals for different gifts. Elk give part of its hide so it would have something to cover itself with to protect itself from the elements. Until finally, Coyote gets to the big river, the Nichiwana. And near a place called Celilo Falls, the salmon are returning, and they're jumping up over the falls. And he yells out over the great roar and echo of the falls, this thing called human is coming, and Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. Salmon jumps up and eddies out and says, I have 2 gifts. 2 gifts. This is new. Salmon say, first and foremost, I will give up of my voice completely. So this thing called human will have a common language. And sure enough, it's called Chinook jargon where I'm from. It's the common trading language that is used all the way from southern Canada throughout the Columbia River Basin into the northern Great Basin and northern California and out to the coast. And the second gift, Salmon said he would give, is of himself completely. This thing called human must nourish itself on something, and it can nourish itself on me. But in return, we ask something of our Creator. Coyote says, what is that? That it protect the flora and fauna, that it protects all the gifts that we have given it, that it keep a covenant to be the stewards of these resources. These are the stories that my grandfather taught me, and the ethic from which I come from of understanding land and water, flora and fauna. That as human beings, our life on this earth is intertwined with all living creatures, which is including the rocks. Because at one time, there were warm, hot lava, or molten lava, that froze in time. It includes those plants to ensure that we have healthy ecosystems that support the plants, that support the animals, that support us in who we are as human beings. It's this land ethic that I've carried with me for over 50 years now, and why I eventually chose to go in the field of natural resource management and stewardship. And what better place to do so than in the National Park Service? I was called shortly after President Biden won office and asked if I had any interest in being the 19th director of the National Park Service. And I laughed at the poor young woman on the other end because I thought somebody was joking. Because I was an outsider to the National Park Service. I'd spent the majority of my career actually throwing rocks at the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, and Bureau of Reclamation about their responsibility to be better stewards of those resources. To understand that we as humans are not separate of those resources. That we have to have a reciprocal relationship with those resources to ensure that they return year after year after year after year, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. Now, out of all of the current bureaus that are within the Department of Interior, the National Park Service 1916 Organic Act does just that. It says that we must protect these places, the flora and fauna, for the enjoyment of the American people, not just now, but for generations to come. Some people argue those are two different missions. They are not. They are one and the same. The folks that wrote the 1916 Organic Act understood the importance of the reciprocation between those two and understood that it had to be one common mission in order to hold so that we would have a generation of stewards to come to ensure that we protect these places that we love so well. The National Park Service currently has 425 national parks, monuments, memorials, landscapes, and places that we love and protect as American people. It encompasses 85 million acres of land, over 70,000 pieces of assets, tens of thousands of miles of trail, and it has a workforce of 20,000 who have dedicated their lives to protecting these places that we love as Americans. But it's getting harder and harder for us to recruit more. Clemson does a wonderful job of helping us bring in many of you in the graduate program and undergraduate program into the National Park Service. And we in the National Park Service are grateful to that relationship. We're grateful to Texas A&M. We're grateful to Colorado State University. Those are three institutions that are working in harmony in research and development and understanding of building the next generation of stewards because we need you. We want you. We have to have you if we are going to continue to uphold our trust responsibility to the flora and fauna, to uphold our reciprocating relationship with the flora and fauna. If you take on the challenge to come into the National Park Service, know that it is a challenge. It's a challenge because we've been asked for many, many years to do more with less, when in reality we know you have to do less with less. And yet, people show up day in, day out, wearing the green and the gray, knowing they have a hard job to do, but they do it with love and compassion. The green and the gray and our interrelationship with the other folks who do that in the state park system is also critical, and understanding our symbiotic relationship and reciprocation that we have with our national parks, state parks, county parks, city parks. Because together, we are protecting and preserving these places that we love for our children, our grandchildren, and their children's children. But to do so, we must have the best educated and understanding of all aspects of what it means to steward a park. We must have interpreters. We must have natural resources and cultural resource staff. We must have administrative officers. We must have people who understand policy. We must have people who understand business. Because the national park system is a complex system that relies on the energy of those who come in with their expertise and skills to apply it to ensure that we do the best job possible. I'm very fortunate to be part of a very small club of the living members of the National Park Service directors. And today we have two with us today. I'm so very pleased with the friendship that I have with Fran Manila and Bob Stanton and acting director David Vela. Because when I run into issues as a steward of the complexity that is the national park system, I know that I can confidentially go to them and express my frustrations, my misunderstandings, and to just get good, sound advice on how to be a better and more effective leader. You all have that opportunity who are students, ensuring that your classmates do that, and that if you join the National Park Service, you will come up in the ranks with people who will do so. But you should also know you have outside influences who can help you, who take other paths and work in state parks, in county parks, and municipal parks that can help you in that process of understanding the importance of the work you do and how to tackle the tough issues. National parks are America's best idea. It didn't come without controversy, though, and I, of all people, know that more than most, because many of the lands that my people have come from, those lands were taken away. They were taken away to be set aside for all Americans, sometimes under threat, sometimes under gun, and sometimes under peace. But as we're building out the next generation of stewards, who better to reach out to than the tribes that have been here for thousands of years? Under the Biden-Harris leadership, under Secretary Haaland and myself, we have a secretarial order between her and Secretary Vilsack that tell us that we are going to do co-stewardship and co-management with American Indian tribes across the United States and their communities. For the first time, there is a huge effort to ensure that tribes are at the table and co-managing these places and co-stewarding them. Why? Because we have a chance to use that indigenous knowledge to help us better understand the relationship we as humans have with the flora and fauna, the water and the wind, and the land itself. It's important for us to be able to find these, especially in this, the most challenging time we face as human beings. Climate change is the largest existential threat we have as human beings. It is accelerating at a pace that is truly unbelievable and truly remarkable as we are trying to tackle it while trying to understand better what's causing it and where it's happening. What most Americans haven't realized, though, in the 30,000 years that natives have been here, because when I was a kid, we were here for 10,000 years. And then by the time I finished college, somebody said we'd been here for 12 to 15,000 years. In the early 2000s, it was 16,000 years. I don't know why this is important to people, but it seems to be very important to some people. And now we know it's at least 26,000 years, if not longer. But if you look at that time frame of 30,000 years, there were at least 3 other major climate change events that these people have experienced. Huge shifts in climate. 2 ice ages, a warming of the earth. We have stories that are thousands of years old that tell us how we dealt with those issues and how we managed the landscape. Because native people, like all other human people, have managed their landscape. They've manipulated it to fit their needs, their wants, and their desires. They've also done it in a way like every other human being and made mistakes. Example, anybody here been to Phoenix, Arizona? If you go down to Phoenix, in and around Phoenix, Arizona, there are over 5,000 miles of canals that once had hooked into the Gila River. And these canals were used to be a farming base. Now, when the first settlers came into the Phoenix Valley, they assumed that another European power had been there before them and had been doing farming practices. They didn't go up into the hills where all the native people were living and ask them who put these canals there. Because had they done that, they would have learned that tribes 2,500 years before had moved in and tried to harness the Great Gila River and remake that into a green valley for agricultural purposes. And it failed miserably. So they abandoned their canals and their agricultural system, and they moved to the mountains where there was water, and where there was food sources, and where there was sustenance. And here we are in the year 2023, in one of the largest droughts we've seen out west, and we're still trying to build infrastructure in the Phoenix Valley. We don't have much time to really begin to learn from those lessons that are thousands of years old so that we can better prepare for what is coming for us and how we're going to have to manipulate these ground places in order to ensure that they sustain us as human beings in a way that we've been stewarding for the last 100 years in the National Park Service, but also understanding new ways of stewarding. Tribes can tell you the stories of how even forests have changed through silviculture. Different trees were planted in certain forests 20,000 years ago. We know that in Northern California, when the water was 200 feet below where it was now, that there was a different type of redwood forest than there is today. As the weather changed, tribes experimented and determined which trees were much stronger in order to plant and build those out. They ensured meadows had enough plant sources in it to feed the different types of animals that they needed to live off of. They manipulated those landscapes in great ways to ensure that it sustained themselves and that they can live in a more harmonious way, but not a more harmonious way with the environment, but not in a way that took away the absence of human interaction. Because while not every American Indian and Native person was an agriculturalist, they were horticulturalists. These methods of knowing, the indigenous way of knowing, the bringing of indigenous knowledge is extremely important for us to partner with in the National Park Service, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, with the Bureau of Land Management, with the U.S. Forest Service, in order to better understand how we can ensure the flora and fauna that we love are sustainable or adaptable to the new climates that we are seeing. We've seen some really good efforts in that. Most recently was with our partners at the U.S. Forest Service. In a place that I'm from in Northeast Oregon, in the Wallowa Valley, there had been a huge effort in the Wallowa Valley to replant camas roots, and the Forest Service kept wanting to replant camas into the forest until they met with the Nez Perce people who told them of a story about coyote once again. And when coyote was responsible for putting back out different trees and plants around the area, the one place he couldn't reach was under his belly. And because he was floating over the sky and couldn't reach his belly, that's why there had never been any camas there before. Looking at that research of how old that story was, it takes you back to 10,000 years, and you realize that when during the Ice Age and the ice retreating in the Wallowa Valley, that the camas root never actually existed there. But there had been a misunderstanding, and by the good efforts of the Forest Service, thought they were doing the right thing by trying to replant camas in an area, but it wasn't surviving. Had they talked to the tribe, they wouldn't have had to spend the effort. And once they did talk to the tribe, they came up with a better effort of returning traditional foods to the tribe and working with them in lands where it was sustainable and where it's practical. But these stories that are thousands of years old are important that we told in a way that they're not exploited, but they're used in commonality with our fellow human beings so that we can preserve and protect these places that we love. So the next generation of stewards, you all have a chance to learn modern science, modern Western practices, and yet learn ancient ways together in order to assure the survivability of flora and fauna and our own health as human beings on these places. We in the National Park Service are doing just that. We are looking at and talking with tribes in Maine. We now are looking and realizing that the forests that we had once preserved in and around Maine at Acadia has to be different. We are now planting trees that are actually had been more populated in southern Massachusetts because of how climate change is changing. The trees that were once the main stands that we had in Acadia, which had between a 70 to 100% survival rate, are now at a 30% survival rate. We've had to find other trees to come into those areas in order to ensure the survival rate of new trees. We're learning from our practices. And it's hard for an organization that's used to doing the same thing over and over because they believe in that's their charge, that they must keep it the way they found it. But the reality for us, as we are seeing this threat of climate change, we have to learn new ways. We learn that through Western science and through ancient understanding of our worlds together. Because only together can we going to be able to face this threat and find ways to mitigate for it and be more resilient for future generations. That's the downside of things. The upside of things in the National Park Service is the stewardship of our storytelling. It's important that each and every one of us see ourselves in our national parks. And I don't care if you were just sworn in as an American yesterday or you've been here for 30,000 years. These places have rich, important stories of America. What I've learned as the National Park Service Director, we don't just serve as the memory of the United States. We serve as its consciousness. What does that mean? It means when we tell our stories in the parks, we tell it based on new scholarship, that we aren't running away from new scholarship, of telling stories in a new and a different way. Whether that is the Reconstruction period in the United States, whether that is the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, whether that is the expansion of the West, it's important that we tell all sides of the story from all the people who were there to get a much fuller and better understanding of who we are as Americans. To recognize the mistakes that we may have made, and to ensure that we don't practice them again. But we can't do that unless we really look at history. It's not being woke. It's not about being woke. It's about understanding who we are as human beings and how we've treated each other. In some cases, we've treated each other very poorly, and others we've done very well. But regardless, we need to lift up both stories so that we don't repeat our past with the bad things and that we continue to propagate the good things we do with each other as human beings. The National Park Service does that in the storytelling it tells across the United States. 85 million acres, we have the largest classroom of anyone, and we have teachers at all levels to tell those stories. How do I know that? In 1989, as a young sailor attending Intelligence A School in Dam Neck, Virginia, we decided to take a trip. We got a friend of ours married up in Maine, and we decided we'd hit every national park, monument, memorial from Maine to Florida. Mostly because I was poor, and they're free. But either way, it was a great way to understand who we were as Americans. It was a great opportunity for us to learn the stories about the United States. It was wonderful for us to learn about the tribes of Maine, the tribes of North Carolina, South Carolina, the tribes and the Seminole people in Florida. It was important for us to be able to understand the original settlements of the folks who came here either on the Mayflower, who were English, who were Dutch, who were French, who were Spanish, how the colonies were formed. It was an opportunity to walk in the footsteps of our fellow Americans so that when we took our oath of office and we took to defend this country, we understood what we were defending. It is the single largest, most transformational moment that I had of understanding who I was as part of this experiment called the United States of America. But what impressed me most was the stop we made in Antietam. And we'd run late because we were at Gettysburg, and we still wanted to get to Antietam to go pay our respect to the 5,000 dead who were buried at the National Cemetery. But it was getting close to closing time. And as we come in, there was a gentleman in green and gray, and he tells us, "You boys have only about an hour, then I have to close those gates." And we told him what we were doing, and he was so generous with his time. He took us down and had us go to the bridge, and the Burnside Bridge, and talk about the battle. He gave an in-depth review of the entire Battle of Antietam. It wasn't until over a decade later that I didn't understand the different types of uniforms the National Park Service wore, that he was not part of interpretation staff, he was not part of cultural resource staff, he was part of maintenance. The green and the gray continue to impress me as the National Park Service director, as I know it has the people who are former National Park staff and the staff that they worked with, the compassion, the love that they have for the park they're in, to understand that park story and to share it with you, and to learn new things and share what they learned new, and to tell those stories fiercely. It's an honor to serve in that capacity. And so for those of you who are out there who are looking at parks and wanting to do interpretation, remember to share your stories with every member of staff, because they take those stories and they share them with others. And in this particular case, this guy could have wrote his master's thesis on the Battle of Antietam. It is exciting to understand, though, that we have this generation. Being here just yesterday, today, and talking to the students, both undergraduate and graduates, excites me to know that we have this next generation of stewards stepping up and preparing themselves to take over in these footsteps that I'm walking in now, to walk in your fellow American footsteps who have continued to be the good stewards of these places that we love. The challenge is great for the National Park Service. While we may not be the biggest bureau overall as far as land management, 85 million acres is nothing to sneeze at. And the assets that we have to protect and preserve are just as important. The historical buildings, whether it's Independence Hall or whether it's an old cabin somewhere in the Sierras, they have a story to tell that tell us about us as who we are, the good, the bad, the ugly of being Americans. We are very fortunate to have currently 3 forms of funding: the Great American Outdoors Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, that are really chipping away at our backlog of deferred maintenance. We have dedicated staff who are going out there and learning how to preserve these sites, to build in resiliency because of climate change, so that these buildings that have been in our history for hundreds of years will be there for another 100 years from now, so that we can continue to tell these stories of who we are. But it takes a lot of education and understanding to do that on all different levels. So I wish to just thank you all, and I want to take questions as long as I can before I have to jump on a plane and go back to Washington and talk with members of Congress to ensure that they come up with a funding bill to ensure that we continue to protect these places we love. So thank you for having me here today.
Testing.
Hello. Okay, this works. Well, I just want to say first, you're a very eloquent speaker, and it was amazing to listen to you. My question is that, as someone who directs the National Park Service, I assume that you have a large range of responsibilities, and you're constantly delving into unknown territory, which means that there's a lot of difficult decisions to be made. With this kind of sort of pressure on your shoulders, where do you find the clarity, or what do you believe is most valuable in order to take that first step into the unknown?
It's a great question. I will say more unfortunately than anything else, I served in the first Gulf War in 1991. I was the senior targeteer for an entire battle force, which means I planned what targets we were going to go take and kill. I don't wish that on anybody, to have to make those decisions. So I sleep well at night because I got through that. What gives me more heartache are my children. I'm more worried about them. But that being said, there are hard decisions to make in the National Park Service, but there is a great and wonderful cadre of staff. I have a wonderful National Leadership Council that are made up of all of the associate directors, regional directors, and we meet regularly. We tackle those issues together, and then it comes up and it works its way to the executive staff. And my executive staff, they have, in federal service, the other three members have over nearly 100 years of practical service. And so we take that information, we debate it, we talk about it, but then a decision has to be made. And those decisions do come, and the buck stops here, and I'll make that decision, right, wrong, or indifferent, but I also have to take accountability and responsibility for it. And that is not always easy. And so, yes, we've had some very tough decisions to make, and that we haven't shrunk from. Most recently, it was around immigration, and many of you probably have read the decision that we had to make about Floyd Bennett Field in New York City. Now, the Organic Act tells us to protect these places, and we must protect those places, but the President of the United States said we are going to come together as all of government to figure this out. And New York City approached us, and we talked about the pros and cons of putting that on a national park. But in the end, it came down to a humanitarian crisis. And the staff there understood the humanitarian crisis, and the decision was made that we were going to go ahead and allow for them to lease that property, but they had to provide all the other services, including security. It was not an easy decision, and it was not made in a vacuum. And it was made with every possibility to ensure that we protect those resources that we're charged to protect at Floyd Bennett Field in and around the area. But you're absolutely right, those are tough decisions to make. But it became a humanitarian crisis issue, and that's the way I view it, and we're going to do our part as part of all of government.
Hello, and thank you for coming to Clemson, first of all. I'd just like to thank you for that. As a local here who really enjoys the national parks and the national monuments around here and loves being able to come to these places, I really do appreciate the National Park Service's efforts in educating people on the history of these places, telling native stories and all of that. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is, how do you think we can implement this stuff outside of our parks in places like research or education, so that we can ensure that these stories are heard everywhere and that they're being incorporated into all aspects of our efforts in conservation? Thank you.
You know, we are talking about that, especially as we get prepared to talk about America 250 in the National Park Service. How can we help other parks and other institutions be able to tell the broader story of America, to tell those tougher stories? Because we recognize that in order to create this more perfect union, it has to be all of us or none of us. United we stand, divided we fall. But we are stronger as a nation by the diversity of stories that we can tell, because we are stronger as a nation by the diversity we hold. What do we know best in the natural world? In ecology and ecological function, you must have diversity in order for that system to support itself of multiple flora and fauna. And yet as human beings, for whatever reason, we've categorized ourselves as different types of humans based on color and ethnicity, which divides us rather than brings us together as Americans, in my opinion. And our strength lies in those different cultural values, those different upbringings, those different lifestyles, because that's what strengthens our union overall. And so A250 is going to be a great opportunity for us to tell a wide set of stories, especially around the folks who were left out in our Declaration of Independence. Women. Abigail Adams had told John Adams, don't forget about the women, and yet they were forgotten about. We're going to talk about slavery, and what did that mean to the African American community? What did they have to do? Which will lead us into the civil reconstruction and the civil rights movement. These things that we take seriously in the national parks, in our reconstruction parks, in our civil rights parks, to tell that story more broadly and how their contributions have made America better and stronger as a free and democratic society. My own people were called out for their savagery. We're going to talk about what Western expansionism has caused with that, but then we're going to talk about how Native people, when they weren't citizens, 10,000 of them went off to fight in the First World War and volunteered and ensured in 1924 that the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. We can tell those stories, and we need to do those in partnership with the local gateway communities we're in the states we're in, so that we can share those broader stories of what it means to be an American in this experiment. Where have we gone wrong in that experiment? What did we learn from it? And how we're doing better in order to become a stronger union.
Given the budget occurrences of the last week, I felt like I should ask a question or get your perspectives on something related to that. It seems that in the past few budget cycles, with looming shutdowns, states have stepped forward to try to keep open National Park Service sites, and there might be pluses and minuses to that. I was wondering if you could offer your perspective on that.
You know, when we looked at it, especially in this plan, and when we rolled out our plan for the shutdown, we ensured that there was a donation section that allowed us to work with states so that they could donate to open those parks and keep them operating. And we are hugely thankful for the supports of states when and where they can do that, but recognizing that every state can do that. That being said, it is also not the responsibility of the state to keep our National Park Service open. It is the responsibility of the United States Congress to fund it and for us to ensure that we protect, preserve it, and keep those doors open. And when we were going through our plan, we were looking at just how we can do that, especially at parks where there was accessibility, meaning that they can walk into the park regardless of a gate down or not, and how do we protect those services during any potential shutdown. But no, the states, Utah, New York, Colorado, Arizona were very quick to offer their services and help towards that end. And if we get there, we will have a plan in order to figure out how we can work with their donations and with associations that support the parks to figure out how to keep those parks open. But first and foremost is really working with Congress, and I will be doing that over the next 42 days and talking to members of Congress about our budget and trying to get us at the deal that the president had made when they were able to increase the debt limit and ensure that we are at least at 2023 budget cycle where we were, because we were pretty healthy in 2023. We were pretty healthy in 2022. We were starting to build out our base budgets and operations. We need that in order for the parks to be able to hire and bring in that next generation of stewards. If they fail to do so, then we will have to figure out how to do what we can with the money we have. And as I pointed out, I grew up in an era during when I was in the service that told us to do more with less. The reality that I've learned is that you have to do less with less. So things have to get cut out. Those are hard decisions that may have to be made. I hope we don't get there because we need to ensure that over 70% of the budget of the National Park Service is about human beings. It's about paying staff to do the work that they do. Those folks deserve to have family wage earnings, and they deserve to have step increases so that they can continue to the jobs they love, and it needs to be on par with the outside sector so that they can do those jobs.
I just wanted to ask, as you've mentioned over the last couple of topics about the budget and politics, where do you see the national parks heading with this upcoming election and everything involved with the situation of politics?
That's a good one. One of the things that, like I said, I love about the National Park Service is it is typically the most apolitical of any bureau. The reason why is that it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, people love their parks. And I feel so fortunate that my peer group of those who have left the service and retired from them, Fran Manila, Bob Stanton, John Jarvis, Director Ron Walker, they've all offered their voice to me about that. And they come from all different political backgrounds. And so they have helped me understand how do we talk about the national parks in an apolitical way when I'm meeting with both sides. I don't care, Democrat or Republican, reminding them Americans don't care about your political affiliation when you come in the park. Nobody's asking you. Nobody even cares about it. What they care about is coming into the park and enjoying the park as they have for generations with their own families, people coming in and learning about the park. So it's important that we stay that line and point out that parks really are just about the American people and then protecting our histories and our resources for ourselves and those future generations. And so I try not to bring in the partisan politics in that and just talk about what we need as resources in order to continue on that responsibility. As I remind Congress, with a few exceptions where a president makes a national monument or park that has been through the Antiquities Act, that it is Congress who makes parks. The National Park Service does not make parks.
Do one. It's on, okay. After spending 4 decades in a national park and looking at interpretation and also biodiversity and global climate change and listening to people like Dr. E.O. Wilson talk about, we need 2 worlds to sustain the current population. What kind of message do you think the National Park Service should convey with regard to how do we control our population? Do we need to? It's very controversial. Is it a story that we should tell?
That is a great question, Phil. The question is, I don't know if that's our role, but it's one that I think we should wrestle with. I think it is one that is open for discussion and debate, and I think we should be visiting with scholars and talking about what that could or couldn't be. We have a finite amount of resources, which is interesting because I was brought up in a culture that told me that I had limited wants with unlimited resources, that my wants really are shelter, fire, food, and water, and that I have unlimited resources to do so. But the Western paradigm is that I have unlimited wants and limited resources. So I really believe that's what the discussion should be about. Do we continue around parks with the idea that we have unlimited wants with limited resources, or do we talk about that we have limited wants with multiple resources, but how do we bring them to bear? I think that would be the more informed discussion, but it is one we should be debating and discussing, and I'm happy to bring that back to the National Leadership Council for us to begin that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice the way you conveyed all the sentiments about the national park. I come back from India, and out of the 6 weeks I spend here, 5 weeks are in national parks, so it's a great time. I just wanted for you to consider, there is a lot of resources available in the Global Climate Change Fund, in the World Bank, in international finance institutions, and also in private sector philanthropy. Have you been able to access, because you're doing carbon sequestration, you're going for carbon neutrality, and even in US it would be even carbon negativity for the situation that you have. Have you tried to really come together and access these kind of funds which would actually fill in the gap which you are kind of conveying? We are trying to do this in India. You just want it in a small way. It's not easy to do it, but I think in US with the kind of professionalism you have, maybe you'll be able to succeed. So I did nonprofit. I was a nonprofit director many times. And for those who don't know, if you ever become an executive director of a nonprofit, an executive director of a nonprofit, there's only a 13% chance you'd ever do it twice. I did it 5 times. So I'm a rarity, and I guess I just like being punished. But that being said, what I've learned through that process of being a nonprofit executive director is that money attracts money. And more importantly, for the first time, we have a historical influx through the Inflation Reduction Act, in which the National Park Service received $190 million.
We've deployed the first $44 million of it last month out into the field, and I'm now having those discussions with the National Park Foundation, others in the foundation and philanthropy world of, here's your chance. I'm showing up with money. I need your help so that we can expand this program to not just include what's in the parks, but also what's on the boundary of the parks, because our ecological function does not stay just in the boundary of a park. And our chance to deal with climate change is an opportunity with us to work with the World Bank, the opportunity to work with the National Parks Foundation, our opportunity to work with our associations in and around parks and their network to come with a much more holistic approach to this. We are having this discussion also as using some keystone species around this for rehabilitation as we look at climate change and bringing back endangered species such as the bison. In the trilateral discussions between my counterparts in Mexico and Canada, we are using buffalo and prairie grass as our focal point to figure out how we can ensure a corridor that goes from northern Mexico all the way into central Canada. And then we're now wanting to talk again with the World Bank and others in our sphere in showing the amount of money that we're putting into that and those programs so that we can attract that money to it. But yes, I think before, when we weren't showing up with any money, nobody just wanted to give us money. But once you show up with a little cash, I think we should be able to harness that joint effort and show how that cascades upon itself to show that we're doing a better effort in resiliency and mitigation around climate change.
Let's have a big round of applause.
Well, that hour went very fast. Thank you all, and thank you for having me here at Clemson.
And as a token of appreciation, we're officially making Director Sams part of the Clemson family. And thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Happy to. Thank you all.